If you open most ancient maps, you'll see that the crossing of the Red Sea is treated as an impossible event or a mistranslation about shallow waters. However, deep sea divers and sonars have found something that science cannot explain otherwise. A graveyard of Egyptian chariots and mineralized bones at the bottom of an oceanic abyss. We're not talking about theories, but about images of corals that grew over wheels and axles, exactly where the Bible says the Egyptian army was stopped. Today, we're going to reveal 10 moments when science had to bow to the facts and admit that biblical miracles left traces that time couldn't erase. The Bible describes in Genesis a colossal structure for Noah's Ark, a rectangular box designed to survive the end of the world. And the question everyone asks isn't how was it built, but where did it end up? The biblical text is specific. The Ark rested on the mountains of Ararat. For centuries, explorers climbed the ice-covered peak without success. But in 1959, a Turkish pilot noticed something strange in an aerial photograph of a region 19 miles from the summit, in a place called Durupinar. There was a geological formation that didn't look natural. It had the exact shape of a ship, with a pointed bow and rounded stern. When they measured the formation, the shock was immediate. The length was exactly 515 feet. If you convert the 300 cubits Egyptian from Moses' time, the result is exactly 515 feet. The mathematical coincidence is impossible. Skeptics said it was just a curious rock formation. But in the following decades, researcher Ron Wyatt and others used ground-penetrating radar to see what was beneath the Earth. The radar revealed a pattern of lines crossing at right angles, suggesting an artificial internal structure like petrified wood caves, collapsed decks, and even large anchor stones with drilled holes found in nearby villages used on ancient ships for stability. Beyond the location, the engineering itself validates the account. The Korea Advanced Institute's Ship Research Center analyzed the biblical proportions and concluded that that specific design was impossible to capsize, even in 90-foot waves. In other words, the object found in Turkey has the exact measurements from the Bible, is in the exact location from the Bible, and has the perfect naval aerodynamics described in the Bible. What we see there may be the fossilized skeleton of the largest wooden structure of antiquity, preserved in volcanic mud as a silent testimony that the judgment by waters was real. And in this video, you'll still discover what sonars found at the bottom of the Red Sea that looks like a war cemetery, and the stone discovered in Israel that made atheists admit that a famous king really existed. The water receded and the wood petrified in the mountains of Turkey. But 1,000 years later, the waters would be the stage for another impossible event. This time, not to float on them, but to walk through them. Most maps in Bibles place the Red Sea crossing in shallow lakes near the Suez Canal, which makes skeptics laugh, saying, it's no miracle to cross a swamp. But if we look at the geography with the eyes of a military strategist, the story changes location. There's a strong theory, supported by explorers like Leonard Muller, that the real crossing happened in the Gulf of Aqaba, specifically at Nuweiba Beach. This is the only location that fits perfectly with the biblical description of being cornered. A giant beach surrounded by impassable mountains that end directly in the sea, with no escape route. If you were there with the Egyptian army coming behind you, the only way out would be to enter the water. The problem is that the Gulf of Aqaba is a deep rift, reaching almost 1¼ miles deep, an abyss where nobody would survive walking. But depth sonars revealed something extraordinary exactly at this beach. A natural land bridge submerged. It's an elevated strip on the ocean floor that connects the Egyptian coast to the Saudi Arabian coast, with a gentle 6-degree incline. It's like a wide and safe road hidden underwater, perfect for the passage of millions of people and livestock, exactly at the point where the Bible says they were. But the most shocking evidence isn't in the geology, it's in what was left behind. Divers and expeditions that descended into this specific area documented bizarre coral formations that don't exist anywhere else in the region. Coral doesn't grow in perfect geometric shapes, but there, they found corals in the shapes of chariot wheels, axles, and cabins. The theory is fascinating. The wood and iron disintegrated over millennia, but the coral grew over them, preserving the exact shape of the 4- and 6-spoke wheels used in the Egyptian 18th dynasty. In addition, mineralized bones of horses and humans were found mixed with the wreckage. So we're not talking about a wind phenomenon in a shallow lake. We're talking about an archaeological cemetery of an elite army at the bottom of a deep sea, preserved as a coral mold. Geography proves the siege, sonar proves the path, and the ocean floor guards the remains of the pursuit. The sea opened to save a people, but closed to hide the greatest war machine of the era. They crossed and left Egypt behind, but now they faced a silent enemy, the impossible logistics of the desert. How to feed and organize an entire nation in a sterile place? The answer may lie in a simple Hebrew word that has been mistranslated for thousands of years. Traditionally, we read that 600,000 men left Egypt, not counting women and children. This would give a total population of more than 2 million people, something equivalent to evacuating the entire city of Houston to the middle of nowhere. If this multitude marched with their herds, the column would be hundreds of miles long. The first Israelite would arrive at Mount Sinai before the last one had left Egypt. This gigantism has always been the main argument of skeptics to say that the Exodus never happened. Because a crowd of that size would leave mountains of trash, broken pottery, and bones, and the Sinai desert is archaeologically silent. But the key to solving this isn't in digging more sand, but in reading the original Hebrew text with the lens of the time. The word used in the Bible for 1,000 is Eleph. In ancient military or census contexts, Eleph rarely meant the mathematical numeral 1,000. The term was used to describe a family unit, a clan or a platoon led by a chief. When the Bible says 600 Elephs, it most likely is listing 600 families or military units, not 600,000 individual soldiers. This reduces the scale of the event to something between 20 and 40,000 people. This changes everything. A group of that size is large enough to be a threat to the small kings of Canaan, as the text describes, but mobile enough to travel quickly and not leave behind the tons of debris that modern archaeologists search for in vain. The lack of massive evidence in the desert is actually the confirmation that we're reading the wrong number, and the proof that they were there before departing exists. Excavations at Tel El-Daba in the Nile Delta identified the ancient city of Avaris. Beneath the Egyptian constructions, they found a huge city populated by Semites, people of the same ethnic origin as the Hebrews. What shocks researchers is that this population grew rapidly and then abandoned the city suddenly, leaving their homes behind, exactly as describes the hurried flight of the Exodus. Archaeology confirms the presence and the departure. Linguistics solves the problem of the invisible multitude. They managed to escape and survive the desert. But they needed a destination. The account says they were guided to a specific mountain to receive the law. For centuries, no one knew where it was, until pilots and explorers noticed a peak in Saudi Arabia that seems to have been burned by a fire that came from the sky. If you open most modern Bibles and look at the map at the end, you'll see Mount Sinai located in the Egyptian peninsula. The problem is that this location was chosen almost 2,000 years after the events, based on the mystical vision of a Roman empress, and not on archaeological evidence. When they excavated the traditional site, they found nothing that matched the biblical account of a camped multitude. But the Apostle Paul wrote in the New Testament in Galatians 4 that Mount Sinai is in Arabia. If we cross the Gulf of Aqaba, following the escape route through the sea that we saw before, we arrive in the ancient land of Midian, in current-day Saudi Arabia, and there exists a peak called Jabal al-Lawz that changes the whole story. The top of this mountain is black, as if it had been burned. Geologists debate whether it's a natural volcanic rock or if it was subjected to inexplicable extreme heat. But the visual coincides perfectly with the description in Exodus that God descended on the mount in fire and the smoke rose like from a furnace. The area around is a vast desert, the only one with enough space to accommodate the thousands of tents of the Israelite camp. Something the tourist site in Egypt doesn't have. And what's at the base of the mountain is even more disturbing for skeptics. Clandestine explorers documented remains of a giant altar made of rough stones, and, drawn on the rocks around, they found dozens of petroglyphs depicting bulls and calves. This is a crucial detail of forensic archaeology. There was no cattle in that region of Arabia, so the drawings don't make sense culturally. Unless they were made by a people who had just left Egypt and who brought with them the memory of the cult to the bull god Apis. It's the physical proof of the golden calf episode, engraved in stone in the exact place where the idolatry happened. In addition, a few miles from there exists a rock almost 65 feet high, split in half from top to bottom. The base of this rock shows clear signs of erosion by water, deep flow marks in a region where it almost never rains. This aligns with the account of the rock of Horeb, where Moses struck his staff and water came out for the people to drink. We have the burned mount, the altar of the calf, and the rock of water, all in the same geographic radius. With the law received and the covenant established, they left the desert to conquer the promised land. But the entrance wouldn't be easy. The first city on the way was a military fortress surrounded by double walls that engineers of the time considered impossible to bring down. Jericho wasn't just a city, it was a Bronze Age bunker built to be invincible. Situated in the Jordan Valley, it guarded the entrance to the Promised Land with a double defense system that humiliated any invading army. There was a stone retaining wall at the base, 13 feet high, and on top of it, a mud brick wall that rose another 26 feet. To make it worse, there was a second, even higher wall surrounding the internal part. Anyone looking from below saw a vertical barrier of almost 50 feet. There were no battering rams or catapults at that time capable of scratching this fortification. The order that Joshua received to march in silence around the city for 7 days seemed like tactical suicide, exposing his soldiers to the archers in the towers without shooting back a single arrow. But on the 7th day, at the sound of the trumpets, the text says that the wall fell down. For decades, archaeologists debated whether this really happened, since ancient excavations, like those of Kathleen Kenyon in the 50s, said the city was already destroyed before Joshua's arrival. However, a new detailed analysis made by archaeologist Bryant Wood reviewed the pottery found at the site and corrected the dating, placing the destruction exactly at the end of the Bronze Age, the time of the biblical conquest. And what they found at the base of the artificial mound of the city solves the mystery of the invasion. The excavations revealed a massive pile of red bricks that fell from the upper wall and accumulated at the base of the lower stone wall. The physics of the fall is the crucial detail. The bricks didn't fall inward. as would happen if they were pushed by invaders, nor randomly. They fell outward, forming a perfect natural ramp that allowed an army to climb over the rubble and take the city. This confirms exactly the Hebrew phrase used in Joshua 6, verse 20, which says that the people went up into the city, each one straight ahead. Beyond the ramp, the team found dozens of large jars full of carbonized grain in almost every excavated house. This is a very rare find in war archaeology. Normally, besieged cities consume all the food before falling, or the victors steal the grain, which was valuable like money. Finding full and burned grain proves two specific things from the account. The siege was very short of a few days, and the invaders didn't loot the city, obeying Joshua's strict order that everything there was forbidden and should be burned. If you believe that God has power to bring down the impossible barriers in your life, comment now. Walls will fall. The conquest began with a bang, but to establish themselves as a nation, they would need, centuries later, a leader who would unify the tribes. The Bible calls this man King David. But for a long time, official history said he was just a folkloric legend until a piece of black basalt was unearthed in northern Israel. In 1993, an excavation team in northern Israel, led by archaeologist Abraham Byron, was cleaning debris at a site called Tel Dan. They weren't expecting to find anything beyond old walls. For decades, the academic world was dominated by what they called biblical minimalism. This school of thought categorically stated that King David never existed as a real historical figure. For them, the stories of David killing Goliath and unifying the tribes were just folklore. Comparable to the legends of King Arthur in Britain, invented centuries later to give a national identity to the Hebrews. The argument was logical. Egypt and Assyria recorded everything, but had never mentioned the name David in any official document. But that afternoon, one of the volunteers turned over a piece of black basalt that had been broken and reused in the construction of a later wall. The sunlight hit an inscription in ancient Aramaic. It wasn't a Hebrew text, but a victory stele erected by an enemy king, probably Hazael of Damascus, dated to the 9th century before Christ. The text celebrated the military defeat of neighboring kings and contained a specific phrase that dropped like a bomb in the archaeological world. Beit David, which translated means House of David. So the Phantom King theory collapsed instantly. Ancient kings didn't spend fortunes carving stones to brag about having defeated imaginary dynasties. The presence of the name on an enemy victory monument is the strongest possible historical proof, because an adversary would have no reason to validate their opponent's lineage if it weren't real and powerful. The Tel Dan Stele transformed David from a character in children's stories into a flesh-and-blood historical monarch, founder of a dynasty recognized internationally by the powers of the time. The Bible was recording the correct political chronicle of the Iron Age. With the royal lineage confirmed, the kingdom established by David grew, but success attracted the attention of the cruelest empire of antiquity. 300 years later, Jerusalem would be surrounded by an Assyrian army that had the reputation of skinning their enemies alive. The city should have been annihilated, but survived thanks to an underground engineering work that defies logic and that still runs water to this day. The year is 701 before Christ, and the most sadistic army on earth is camped outside the gates. The Assyrian king Sennacherib had the habit of recording his victories on hexagonal clay prisms, and one of these artifacts, known as the Taylor Prism, is today in the British Museum. In it, the king boasts saying he trapped Hezekiah, king of Judah, inside Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. The Assyrian record confirms the biblical siege, but curiously, doesn't say he conquered the city. And the reason Jerusalem didn't fall was an engineering work done in haste, under the enemy's nose, that guaranteed the only thing more important than weapons: water. The main water source, the Gihon Spring, was outside the walls, vulnerable to the enemy. If the Assyrians took it, the city would die of thirst in days. The Bible recounts in 2 Kings 20 that Hezekiah made a pool and an aqueduct to bring the water inside the city. What seems like a footnote in the text is actually a tunnel of 1,750 feet carved in solid rock, in total darkness, using only iron pickaxes and oil lamps. The impressive detail is that two teams started digging from opposite sides of the mountain to meet in the middle. Without GPS or modern compasses, the chance of missing each other was almost 100%. But in 1880, a young man swimming at the tunnel's exit, now known as Hezekiah's Tunnel, discovered an ancient inscription on the wall, the Siloam inscription, which is now in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. The text isn't religious. It's a technical report from the workers describing the exact moment when they heard the voices of the other team through the rock, and how the pickaxes finally met, allowing the water to flow to the pool of Siloam. Geologists who analyzed the tunnel's curves believe they followed natural fissures in the rock or used acoustic signals tapping on the surface to guide themselves. The evidence is physical and visitable. You can walk today inside this tunnel with water hitting your knees, exactly where the Bible says King Hezekiah diverted the flow to save his people. Assyria had the brute force, but Jerusalem had hydraulic engineering. The city survived the siege, but centuries later, the sky over that region would announce the arrival of a new king, not with armies, but with a stellar alignment that modern astronomy can track on the computer. Modern astronomy allows us to go back in time and see exactly what the sky was like over Judea 2,000 years ago. For centuries, the Star of Bethlehem was treated only as a poetic element or a miracle that floated low over a house. But the text of Matthew chapter 2 describes something that behaves exactly like a real astrophysical phenomenon. A light that appears in the east, guides travelers for months, and seems to stop over a specific location. The problem is that stars don't stop. However, planets do. Astronomical software simulations, like those used by researcher Rick Larson in the Star of Bethlehem project, show that between years 7 and 2 before Christ, the sky presented a sequence of events so rare that they only happen once every million years. In year 3 before Christ, the planet Jupiter, known in the ancient world as the Star of the King, entered a triple conjunction with the star Regulus, the brightest star in the constellation of Leo. For the Magi of Mesopotamia, who were specialists in reading the sky to predict the rise of empires, this was a coded sign. The King of the Jews, represented by the constellation of Leo, was receiving a crown, represented by the circular movement of Jupiter over Regulus. In year 2 before Christ, Jupiter continued its path and visually merged with Venus, the planet of motherhood, creating the brightest light ever seen in human history, pointing directly to Jerusalem. The detail that solves the mystery of the star that stops is the so-called retrograde motion. When Earth overtakes a planet in its orbit, that planet appears to slow down, stop, and move backwards in the sky for a few days. On that specific date, Jupiter entered retrograde motion exactly over the small village of Bethlehem. Seen from Jerusalem, astronomical science confirms that the sky of Bethlehem didn't have a miracle that violated the laws of physics, but a cosmic clock programmed since creation to mark a specific date. The Magi knew how to read the sign, but the political elite in Jerusalem had no idea what was happening above their heads. This birth would change history, but the man who would grow under this sign would end up in a Roman court. Before a governor that modern historians swore never existed until a stone was turned in 1961. So the sky gave the date, but archaeology gave the name of the man who would seal Jesus' fate in a trial that official history tried to erase. For almost 2,000 years, the only proof that a man named Pontius Pilate existed were the pages of the New Testament and some brief mentions in texts by historians like Flavius Josephus. For many scholars of the 19th and early 20th century, Pilate was a literary figure, a character invented by Christians to give a face to Roman oppression and serve as the villain in the crucifixion story. The skeptics' argument was simple. Rome was an obsessive bureaucratic machine for records. If a man governed the province of Judea for 10 years, where were the statues, the coins, or the stones with his name? Jerusalem and Caesarea seemed to have erased any trace of his existence, fueling the theory that Jesus' trial never occurred in a real court. The situation changed drastically in 1961. A team of Italian archaeologists, led by Dr. Antonio Frova, was conducting excavations at the Roman theater of Caesarea Maritima, the ancient administrative capital of Judea. They found a limestone slab that had been reused as a step in a later renovation of the theater. When they turned the stone, they came face to face with an inscription in Latin that survived the erosion of time. The text clearly said, Pontius Pilatus, Praefectus Judaeae. So the Caesarea stone, today preserved in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, became one of the most important finds in biblical history. It not only confirmed that the name was real, but corrected a common historical error. Many translations called Pilate a procurator, a later administrative title, but the stone proved that his exact title at the time of Jesus was prefect, a direct military command function. This demonstrates that the biblical account was using the correct technical terminology of that specific period, something a forger from centuries later would hardly know. The findings silenced the debate about the historicity of the trial. If the judge was real and occupied exactly the position the Bible described, the legal scenario of Jesus' execution gains an unquestionable physical basis. But the confirmation of a name on a limestone slab opens a door to an even greater and more personal mystery. If Pilate existed and ordered the execution, what happened to the body he authorized to be removed from the cross? There is a cloth that has intrigued scientists for decades, carrying marks that modern technology still hasn't been able to replicate. The most studied and controversial piece of fabric in all human history is kept under maximum security at the Cathedral of Turin in Italy. It's a linen sheet 14 feet long that carries the frontal and dorsal image of a man who suffered exactly the same tortures described in the Gospels. Marks of Roman flagellation, nail perforations in the wrists, and a spear wound in the chest. For centuries, the shroud was venerated as the real cloth that wrapped Jesus in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. But in 1988, 3 laboratories in Oxford, Zurich, and Tucson performed the carbon-14 test and announced that the fabric dated from the Middle Ages. The academic world declared the case closed as a medieval artistic fraud. Although no one could explain how the image was made, it happens that science isn't a static process, and the verdict from decades ago is being seriously questioned by new chemical and structural analysis technologies. Researchers like Italian scientist Liberato De Caro from the Crystallography Institute of the National Research Council used in 2022 an advanced technique called wide-angle X-ray scattering to examine the natural aging of the linen's cellulose fibers. The result of this new study totally contradicts the previous carbon test. suggesting that the fabric is actually about 2,000 years old, which places it perfectly in the time of Christ. The theory is that the sample tested in the 80s may have been taken from an area that suffered medieval patches after a fire, contaminating the result. So the shroud returned to the center of scientific debate as a mystery without technical solution. Engineers from the Italian Space Agency tried to replicate the image using ultraviolet light lasers and discovered that the impression isn't paint, isn't pigment, and doesn't go through the fabric's fibers. It's only on the thinnest surface layer, as if it had been engraved by an instant and intense energy discharge. It's an image that behaves like a photographic negative created millennia before the invention of photography. Science can date the fibers and analyze the type AB blood found on the cloth, but stops at the frontier of the impossible when trying to explain how that mark was produced. The shroud remains as the greatest puzzle of modern archaeology, a physical evidence that defies logic and invites reflection about what really happened in that tomb in Jerusalem. If you enjoyed the video, be part of our Christian community here on YouTube. Click subscribe to the channel. There's a new video every day. Now click on the video on the screen to discover what is the origin of Goliath. Where did he come from? There are theories that point to a very dark past for his lineage. Like the Nephilim giants, click on the video on the screen now and find out.